Hello YouTube, welcome to this video where we're going to be talking about science. This is a segment I've wanted to make for a very long time, and I actually made an introduction to that topic roughly 7 months ago. And I'm going to put that video in the description because it's going to give you a good idea of the mindset I'm in and of the ideas I'm trying to convey. So, this entire thing is going to work as a trilogy because I'm going to make 3 episodes. And for each episode, I'm going to tackle the issue from a different angle. And you will see that I'm sort of going to engage in a schizophrenic argument in a sense, because I will try and espouse different point of views, and I will try and attack and protect different perspectives. Because I want to be able to give you something that I consider unbiased and not just the fruit of my subjective reasoning. And so, the entire crux of the discussion is going to be centered again around science. Because for anyone who has eyes to see, you must have noticed that science has infiltrated YouTube fitness with vigor for the past few years to the point where it has free reign and it really has become something that you cannot avoid. It is now part of the panorama. And so it is something that is worthy of discussion because I do believe that it has reached a point where it has turned from either baseless to sometimes annoying to downright dangerous, at least for the intellectual ability of this environment and of this platform to subsist and grow. So I have actually a big list that I want to go through, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that introduction. But keep in mind one thing, when I talk about science, we're not talking about nuclear science, we're not talking about biology, we're not talking about advanced applications of mathematics. This is the meme and the layman term science that I'm using here, which is really just the application of the mind as related to a certain topic. And so in this case, it's going to be fitness. It's going to be growing muscles, it's going to be getting stronger, etc., etc. So, to start the argument, I first want to discuss the scientific process, because it's going to be crucial to my argument. The scientific process, as described in the thumbnail that is most likely too small for you to see, is a multi-step process that has very strictly defined codifications that need to be followed. And if one or several steps are completely avoided, the entire process is null. And that is something that across the board is extremely present in YouTube fitness when it comes to science, meaning that you rarely, if ever, get a chance to witness an integral scientific process put in place. It's always something that is either cut in half or that pretends to be scientific, but across the board isn't. And that is that falseness that I want to point out here and attack. So, in terms of where I stand when it comes to science, you must have noticed on this channel that I don't really use studies to prove my points. I don't link them in the description, and I especially don't use them as arguments of authority to prove that I'm right. And the reason why I don't do that is because I personally want this channel to be coming from my own experience. If you wanted to read papers written by some scientific guy, you could just go on Google and you would get the full experience there. I don't want to provide that. I have zero ambition of being that guy. I just want to tell you what worked for me and what I think will work for you. That's my base. And in a sense, that is also construing the channel as being anti-science, because I'm already placing myself in opposition with what has become the norm on YouTube Fitness, which is science channels. Channels that rely heavily on what they consider to be science to explain lifting, to explain muscle gains, etc. And I want to make clear right now that when I say I'm anti-science, I'm not anti the actual practice of science. I'm anti what it has become. And that's important because I know that an argument that is often used against people who call out these practices is that we're anti-science, as if we're Neanderthals that cannot understand and grasp the concepts of science, and therefore we are just attacking it blindly because we don't get it. That's not the point, but you'll see as I explain that it makes more sense when we get through it. So to go back to the difference between the scientific process and science, well, I'm going to call it meme science. The scientific process is absolutely necessary when you want to discuss such topics because it is highly traceable, meaning that you can look at each step, and if there is a mistake in one step, it nullifies the other step, and therefore it is fully transparent. Understand that the less steps you have in your thought process, the less of an ability the reader has to discover mistakes you might have made because you're essentially making them invisible. Because by not testing certain variables, you are making them, or rather placing them in an environment that is not accessible anymore because it just doesn't exist. And that by itself is fraudulent behavior and it needs to be avoided. And I hold the scientific process in very, very high regards because I know that the people who are dedicated to it do it with integrity and they do it with an open mind that is going to permit them to be proved wrong if something doesn't go the way they planned. My issue with YouTube Fitness and what it has done with science is that they do the exact opposite. And therefore, they're not really using science. It's not science they're using, it's meme science. And so, I have actually compiled a certain amount of terms that I want to throw your way that I personally believe personify the use of science on YouTube Fitness. We're going to start with dogmatic. Science, by default, real science is anti-dogma because it combats ideas that do not have standings in reality. That also means that those same ideas, if they make it to the rank of truth, can and will be proven true across the board several times throughout the years. And the second they fail, the second they cannot be proven true anymore, they disappear in the shadows. This is how it works. This is an anti-dogma practice where you're constantly trying to reassess the situation by looking at the context. What science on YouTube does is the exact opposite. It presents information as being the truth, and it is going to hold onto that truth until the study or the paper gets challenged, gets shredded, and replaced by a new one. And when that new paper comes along, what do these people do? They just embrace the new paper. The issue is that this lacks transparency and it lacks any shred of morality because the issue is that you never hear these people apologize or actually own up to the fact that they pushed studies that were wrong for years and almost made it their identity. And that to me is dishonest. I personally cannot abide by that. This is why also I provide information coming from my opinion. That way, if it changes, I can just say it changed. I don't have to go through all of the micmacs that these guys have to go through because when you are going to scream across town that you have the study that proves that this is X and this is the truth that this is X, the day it is disproven, you are in a pickle because you put all of your money, all of your assets on that one idea being right, and now you've been proven wrong by science. So the best thing to do is just to put it underneath the carpet and move on. That to me is not something that is acceptable. It also has become something that could be considered zealous. And the reason why is, and I will go back to that, but if you look at what most people hold science to these days, it really looks like a religion. It has stopped being the practice of the mind. It has lost its reasoning, it has lost its logical thinking abilities, and it is now just a cult. It is people who are going to believe what they are told by the scientific community, regardless of who these people are, regardless of if they're right or not, and they'll just embrace it. And the day they're told, okay, this is now wrong, we're moving on to that new paper, they'll just jump on the new bandwagon and they won't even question why the first paper was wrong. This is an abhorrent way to approach life. It's not acceptable. As a human, you have the ability to think for yourself. And the issue too with that cult is that they have a built-in defense mechanism. Just like religious people back in the past or even to this day, where if you question their beliefs, they would fire back by saying that you would go to hell, that God was going to punish you, that you were a bad person because you weren't godly, you weren't a zealot like they were, etc., etc. And you see the similar attacks nowadays where people will call you anti-science, they'll say that you are against facts, that you're against the truth, etc. The vicious thing with these scientific types is that they tend to be anti-religious, which is sort of ironic because they don't see that they are very close to that type of people. They are extremely similar. And it gives them a sense of superiority because they truly do think that they are holding on to the truth. And therefore, anyone who doesn't share the same beliefs not only are inferior, but they are also going to be deemed stupid, which is an advantage that they have and that science have over religion. I would really like you to focus on that aspect because in reality, if you look at religion as a way to manipulate people, you will find that science is just an evolved way of doing that, meaning that it's religion without all of the issues of having to justify the existence of God, etc., which are tough to prove in a sense, and it gives an aura of indestructibility to science that makes it completely bulletproof and that allows it to continue manipulating people without any chance or ability to counter it. It also is smug, and smugness is a trait that I particularly dislike. And the smugness comes from the fact that, again, these people think that they are right across the board. Of course, since there is no such thing as a scientific theory that is right for the end of time until the end of times, they are wrong by default because what they think is true now can be disproven in 2 years, in 5 years, etc. And that also speaks to the switch in nature of science, meaning that science exists on a spectrum and it is ever evolving. The day it stops evolving, it cannot be called science anymore. It has to be called what it is, which is a cult or an ideology. And the issue is that by taking a certain paper and fixating it in time and saying, okay, this is the truth and only the truth, those people are missing the point pretty much. They are forgetting that this paper is going to exist on a time lapse. It is the truth now, and even that is questionable because if it is going to be disproven in the future, it means it's not actually the truth now. It's a version of the truth that is going to be beta tested and proven wrong. That is part of the scientific process, but a lot of people don't grasp that, and I'll get to the reason why. But it does give them the sense of moral superiority that allows them to be smug. It's also obsessed with itself. Science has always been a practice that looked outwards because it's the exploration of the wood, pretty much. In a sense, the application of the logical thinking and of rationality, when turned into a practice, is science. And I think that people have lost touch with that reality because when we think of science, we think about very applied physics or mathematics, etc. But in reality, literature is a science. The study of literature is a science. The study of human movement is a science. All of that you can apply your mind to try and comprehend it is science. And therefore, you have also that weird separation that have existed now within science of the scientific community that is focused on expanding outward, but they're producing content and papers for people who are going to use it to recenter inward. Because the paper is going to justify their existence, is going to justify their practice, and therefore they're going to completely clam up around the paper. When in reality, every new paper is a chance to expand your knowledge and to look out and to potentially connect that with something else, which also works because it's going to help you potentially balance the issues of the paper, etc., etc. But it has become that. And the thing too is that this is especially true on YouTube Fitness, and it allows channels to create bastions where they're going to have a little ideology with their followers, and they are going to have beef with the other guy who has a different ideology, and they're going to sort of poke the paper at each other because my paper says it's right, yours says it's wrong, so we're going to have a little fight. Usually, what should happen is that these two individuals should sit down and discuss. But of course, it's not what we see. It is also unbending, and that is the big problem with what people call science on YouTube Fitness. It doesn't leave any room for interpretation, even though papers are to be interpreted, because when you read them, they are not written in the language of truth. You cannot just write a report that is 100% objective. there is a level of subjectivity. If you give me 15 different stats, I can interpret them 15 different ways. I can make the stats say what I want them to say. It's the same for science. You can give me a paper and you can think in your brain that it's going to mean that I'm going to infer a certain meaning to it, but in reality I can come up with a completely different thing. And that is always something that sort of takes science down a peg, because science is not free of opinion, and that's the big issue. You have that god of science now, that big wood in the sky, and it's insane, but I've seen people starting to put a capital letter to the word science as if it was the name of a god, which also tells you that these people worship science. And when you see that, you understand that they don't grasp what it's supposed to be. They don't understand that it's supposed to be something that is challengeable at all times, and that when it stops being challengeable, it stops being science. And it's also anti-speech. And I'm not saying anti-free speech, although we are getting there outside of the realm of YouTube Fitness. Science is used to silence people nowadays. But even within YouTube Fitness, how many times have you had a discussion with someone in the comments, and at some point they get frustrated, they just link a paper and they say, paper says this, I'm right. That is terrifying, because it's the end of our cognizant ability to have discussions with one another. If we're always going to resort to that paper that we take out of our pocket to say, okay, I'm right, just stop talking, might as well just, put tape on people's mouth. It's the same thing. You're essentially saying that you want to cut the conversation short because you're already right. And we don't evolve like this. We are devolving. And that's what science is doing also, is instead of going outwards, which is an expansion, it's going inwards. It's regressing in itself. It's sort of starting to collapse like a black star. And eventually there's going to be a singularity that's going to happen. And I think that this singularity is going to be represented at a microcosmic level in YouTube Fitness, because I think that people are getting tired of it. The YouTube Fitness channels that are based on science will not just disappear, but they're going to see less and less traction, and they're going to have more and more detractors. So those were the terms that I think about when I think about science on YouTube Fitness in general. Now I want to get into more specific elements that I have personally against what YouTube Fitness calls science, which is the meme science. I want to talk about why it's pro-science in the first place. Because if you look at the trajectory of YouTube Fitness, it wasn't always like this. There used to be a time where the people who gave you tips on how to train were complete baboons with low cognizant abilities, who were just pretty much big. They didn't know how to talk real good. They just looked the part and gave advice, and that's it. That's all we had for the most part. And then there was a rise of people who are more regular, in a sense, that look like the everyday Joe, and that also was, in a sense, a marketing tactic on their part, because we tend to connect with people our age. It's also the reason why you see those channels that are ran by kids who are 15 or 16, the Gymshark model, who do very well, because other kids can relate to them. And eventually, there was a switch. And the switch was created by certain YouTube channels that I'm not going to name, you already know them, that started to promote a scientific approach to training. And when that caught on, it caught on real hard. And then a lot of copycats started to pop out, because of course, when someone does something that works on YouTube Fitness, everyone else is going to copy them because they want views. And so now they dominate. I say a lot in my videos that YouTube Fitness is powerlifting centric, and I still stand by it. But beyond that, it is scientific centrist. It is now the role of channels that are going to proclaim that every advice they give is scientific. You see them on their banners, the scientific way to build muscle, the scientific way to be athletic, blah, blah, blah. It has become a marketing scheme. And there's a lot of reasons attached to that. A big one, in my opinion, is that it is the best method to sell things. Because in reality, when you sell a product, what are you selling? You are selling the promise of result. If I sell you a vacuum and it doesn't suck anything, you are going to have a problem with me. If I sell you a program and you do it and you don't gain muscle, you're going to have a problem with me. The big problem, the big occupation of salespeople is, one, to sell you the thing, and two, to find an excuse when the thing doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And science does those two things. One, because you can just claim, oh, this program or this supplement, we researched it using science. It is based on science, which means it must work, right? If science says so, then it must work, right? And of course, for a lot of people who are going to forget the fact that for every science experiment that works, there are 99 failures, it's going to be a very convincing argument, and so they're going to buy it. And when it doesn't work, when it turns out it wasn't super good in the first place, the person who sold it can just say, well, I mean, science says it works, so you're the problem. You must be the problem. And that is a luxury that is not afforded to other fitness YouTubers. Because if you buy some program from Joe Schmo, who is just big, and you tell him, well, the program didn't work, what is he going to say? Do you have bad genetics? I mean, some people try, but they don't have that strong argument that they can just throw in your face to make you feel like a failure. Because if it works according to science, then it should have worked for you. And therefore, you are the genetic dead hand. And it also is, and that sort of ties with that argument too, a way to gain moral high ground. Because you see that across the board on YouTube Fitness, it's drama focused, and the drama also invokes the idea that these people are going to have all battles to decide who's right and who's wrong. And for the most part, these are just excuses to make clicks, but sometimes it's right. Sometimes they actually have a concept that they're attached to and they want to discuss it. And when they are met with opposition, they start to bicker with one another to know who's right and who's wrong. And what it really comes down to is that when you're in that situation, if you have science on your side, you have automatically won. Because you have the greatest ally. You have the God of truth. You have science. Your methods are proven by science, and therefore you are right. And that also means that in an argument between someone who is using logic, reasoning, and experience, and someone who is using science, aka Google, the person who is using science has already won. Because people are going to flock towards that opinion because it is the majority's opinion. It is the sanctified version of the truth. And therefore, in my opinion, it is a highly disintellectual and dishonest argument to use. But it's used across the board all the time. And now we're meeting a sort of chaos where every single YouTuber is based on science nowadays. But in that case, who has the moral high ground? Well, now they actually have to go down to it and read the science, which for the most part they don't know how to do, and it leads to battle of egos, which it was always a battle of ego in the first place, but when it is transcended through the lens of the science god, you really get to see why these people utilize this excuse in the first place. It's because if they don't have it, you get to see what it was about in the first place, which is pretty much they wanted to be right. And I wrote something, and I think it's going to resonate with a lot of people here. I wrote doctor. The reason why I wrote doctor is because, strangely enough, when I started being on YouTube Fitness, all I saw was gym bros. Powerlifters, bodybuilders, calisthenic athletes. But eventually, there started to develop a strange phenomenon on YouTube Fitness where doctors started to appear. Here and there, Dr. X, Dr. Y. And at first, I thought that I was in the wrong and I was looking at the wrong channels and maybe I was starting to research medicine. But no, I was still on YouTube Fitness. It was just being invaded by people who are using their title to sound competent. And to this day, it still exists. How many YouTube channels have the doctor in front of their name? What is the point of that? Do you think that they're going to die if you don't refer to them as doctor? No. It's just a built-in argument of authority that makes them untouchable. They're floating above the ground because they're doctors. First off, let me say that every single person I've met in my entire life who asked to be called and referred to as doctor was an unsufferable, smug idiot across the board 100% of the time, and that for the most part, their academical achievements don't really correlate with anything when it comes to intellectual properties. But the funny thing on YouTube Fitness too is that if you dig a little bit, you will see that a lot of these so-called doctors have degrees, PhDs, in fields that have nothing to do with training, for the most part. In which case, the question is, why do they insist on being called doctor? They insist because people bow down to the title. It's really the ultimate weapon. Not only do you have the god of science on your side, but you are the prophet of the god of science. You're a scientist, you're a doctor. You are indestructible. You are the second coming of Jesus. No one can touch you. If someone who's not a doctor tries to have an argument with you, you can just say, I'm the doctor, you don't know. And that works. Their followers are going to actually respond positively to that argument. It is amazing. And in a sense, I don't even blame them. Why wouldn't they do it? It's so convenient. Plus, you can write books about scientific methods of training, sell them for a few $100, and it's made by a doctor. It's certified by a doctor. How amazing is that? Well, I personally always have my doubts, and I'm always critical of anyone who I see using the term doctor in their handle or in their title or in their channel name, because to me it is, again, dishonest. So now that that is said, I want to take a quick break just to check the time. Ooh, nice. Okay, so as you can see, this is going to be a long video, but I will make timestamps. So besides the doctor thing and what I just explained when it comes to the reason why YouTube Fitness is so science focused, I want to now focus more and scope down on the three things that science is being applied to on this platform, which is going to be movement, stimulus, and diet. And these are what I would call the big three. These are the aspects that science can look in and provide forensic evidence of the best methods that are going to be applied to each. And I'm going to prove to you right now that for each one of these, what YouTube Fitness calls science is actually doing a disservice to the public because they're misusing it. They're not applying their logical and critical thinking, they are applying something that is entirely different. So, the number one is movement. And for movement, I'm referring to movement patterns, right? How many times have you seen someone say, that movement is the best to develop the glutes, that movement is the best to develop the chest? Then another guy says, no, because the study shows that this. This is what I'm talking about here. The issue with that is, first off, that it is highly dependent on the individual. And by that, I'm not necessarily saying that universal cues don't work. I am saying, however, that universal visual cues don't work. You cannot look at someone and say, oh, your knee bent in 12 degrees, so it's bad. No, you don't know how long his bones are. You don't know how his hip sockets insert. You don't know the way his lower back responds to the butt wing. You don't know that. So that never works. What works is overall things that are needed, that need to be avoided in movement patterns to promote muscular engagement and injury prevention. That's it. It's not really a universal cue. So that's already the first problem with that type of study. And in my opinion, for movements, all you need is an understanding of leverages, of center of gravity, both for the weight and for your own body, and an understanding of angles, because it really is all about angles. The back angle essentially is critical for any movement. Back angle, the angle of rotation of the shoulder, of the elbow, of the feet, etc. If you look at these things, it is tough to be betrayed by the biomechanics of the body. But what the scientific focused community on YouTube has created is something where studies generalize greatly and they misrepresent data. As I explained before, you can take data and make it say whatever you want. I work with data. It's pretty much it not necessarily a lie, but data is not the hard fact that people think it is. We make what we want with the data. It's just it's something that can be fabricated into whatever is needed, because it is, and I have the name in my language but not in English, it is une matière première. It is not a finished product in a sense. And so what you see with these people is that they are going to take a study who can have a spectrum, for example. Let's say you do 5 different types of hip hinges and you put them on the spectrum and you say, okay, A and B are this close to one another, and C and D are disclosed. This means that the relationship between A and B and C and D is the same in terms of difference, which also means that the muscular involvement is not that different at the end of the day. I've seen that argument a million times. It's always wrong because it always fails to understand that that difference can be major. You haven't tested with a different thing. For example, if you test a trap bar deadlift and a deadlift and they're this close and you say, oh, they're essentially the same. Okay, but where is your deadlift variation? Where is your style of deadlift in the conventional with the same torso angle? Because if I can have this on the spectrum, now we're going to see if that distance between the two is actually valuable or not. If you don't have that, then the entire study is worthless. And across the board, that's my big message with this, especially for movements, no one reads studies. When you are arguing with someone and they link a study, they haven't read the study. They read the excerpt, if that. Maybe 2 sentences in the excerpt. You know why? Because every single person they love science or scientifically inclined, you know what they do? They go on Google, they type, my idea proved, or the opponent's idea debunked. You know what that does? It creates an echo chamber. Search engines are designed to give you what you want to listen to. They are designed to give you what they think your opinion is going to be because it heightens the chance of you clicking. It's the same for every single website that sells traffic. They want you to stay. So they want to feed you something that is going to make you stay. And therefore, these people are creating a little bubble for themselves, or they're never going to be proven wrong because they will always find a study that proves what they say. You can always find a study that is going to prove a theory, always. It's always possible. The number 2 is going to be stimulus. So stimulus is the amount of volume, the amount of intensity needed, if frequency needs to be 2 times a week, 3 times a week, etc. That is widely discussed in bodybuilding, widely discussed. And you have fringe communities of high intensity trainers, you have high volume trainers who are going to completely ignore certain parameters. And even they, and it's the reason why I say you can always find a study that is going to prove you wrong or prove you right, these people always find a way to prove to you that they're right. I've had discussions with people who did one set of heavy weights. They could find study to prove that they were right. Did it mean that they were right? No, absolutely not. I've met people who train with 45% intensity all year round with 10 by 10s who could show me studies that proved that they were right. Were they right? Of course not. And yet, technically, based on science, they were. This is why this entire thing is a scam. It's a sham. It doesn't work like that. When you remove your ability to understand logically from the experience of science, it stops being science. There's a quote that I especially like that I'm going to just say in French and then translate for you from Rabelais, who says, Science sans conscience n'est que ruine de l'âme, which essentially translates into science without conscience is the soul's ruin. And in this, conscience means both moral, meaning that you're not going to just create monsters because science allows you to, which we're already doing, so we're way past that. And 2, conscience as in your understanding. Because science is that. It's the projection of the mind to create something based on your understanding. If you don't understand, it's not science. It's authority, it's a god, it's religion, but it's not science. And that's the issue with these people, because the people who create the study do so because they have an agenda or they have a point to prove. Because how many times do you see a study that is going to say the back squat is the best movement to build your legs? No one does that. Why? Because everyone already knows it. So there's no spice in it. What is spicy would be to find a study that says the leg press is actually better than the squat. Go on Google right now, type those keywords, you're going to find 15 studies. You know why? Clickbait. It attracts people's eyes. If I can come up with a study that shows that dumbbell flies has better chest activation than bench press, how many people are going to be attracted to that title? A gazillion. Because it's spicy, it is fun, it looks exciting. Even if the study is garbage, but I can guarantee you that if I wanted, I could find you ways to completely trafficate the study to show that indeed you get a better stretch on the dumbbell fly and therefore you get a better activation of the chest. Would that mean you build more muscle with the chest fly? Absolutely not. And yet, it is something that you can see arise in the future. So that is also a big problem. The people who create the study have agendas, they have points to prove, they don't care about manipulating the data, and the people who are going to use the studies that are faulty to prove their point don't even read the studies. And it's a segue, it's a rant. It has personally destroyed portions of my patience because I have had many arguments with people where they eventually throw a study at me thinking that the conversation is over. I go in, I actually read the study, I foolproofed it, and then I come up with like 15 reasons why the study is faulty, and you know what happens then? This silence, because there is no answer, because these people never really cared about science in the first place. They cared about shutting your mouth because they wanted to be right. The last one is going to be, I think I completely skipped over stimulus. Well, stimulus, just to sum it up quickly, is going to be completely dependent on the level of the individual. So it's biased across the board. When you hear people say that it's always best to do more volume, yeah, maybe for you at your level of development. But programming is something that is case by case, and it needs to be experimented, and it needs to be proposed and developed by the person who programs, which is why I always promote the programming when it comes to doing it for yourself and not letting someone else do it for you. And keep in mind also that the reason why you see all of these guys come up with studies on programming is because they want you to believe that they know better so that you can pay them so that they can make your program. But they're always wrong. And then when it comes to diet, so diet is the last one of the three, and diet is the worst. Across the board, the worst of the worst. You have seen it on YouTube Fitness. The issue with diet is that there is such a thing as an emotional connection with food. People already are emotionally attached to YouTubers, which why? Two, they're attached to their training, also why? It's just a tool, and they're attached to their food. Because it's what you put in your body, it's a part, it literally becomes a part of you. It's feeding your cells. And so there is really no surprise that people are going to go completely crazy in the brains and are going to identify with their diet. How many people do you know have one personality and it is their diet? And yes, I'm talking about vegans, but carnists are just as bad. And in everyday life, the type of people who are going to base their entirety of their being on one thing only tend to be unsufferable and they need to be told. But it also creates a chaos and a tempest of arguments on YouTube Fitness because it is the area where there is the biggest amount of random studies, of studies that were paid for by a big industry, a big corporation, and it has become comical, meaning that I read studies sometimes about movement patterns or volume, anything, and sometimes they're correct, sometimes they're incorrect, but it's never blatant. But for the diet ones, they don't even try to hide it. It's right there in the paper. They on purpose select case studies. They select guinea pigs that are flawed because they know it's going to influence the way that their dietary experiment is going to actually come out, because they want the experiment to say a certain thing. Look again at the scientific process. You are not allowed to do that. You cannot come in with an hypothesis. The hypothesis is a broad bracket that is going to englobate a portion of the argument that could or could not be proven right. You cannot come in and say, I want this sentence to be proven right, and every single step of the way I'm going to make sure it's proven right. That's not science. That's pushing a point. That's arguing with yourself, but it cannot be called the scientific process. So that's that for the diet too. And it's the reason why I try and stay away from that. And I don't make many videos about diet is because I do think that logic has completely deserted the minds of the people who are interested by that topic. And at this point, it's pure emotion. Now, let's talk about science versus personal experience. So I'm personally a big advocate of personal experience. And in reality, science and personal experience are not counterintuitive. They're actually supposed to work together. Science is going to offer broad generalizations about groups of people based on certain activities for certain goals. And they're going to give you a rough idea of what you can expect because your level of correspondence with said individual is rather high because you're human and they're human as well. It's the reason why we tend to test certain things on humans and not on mice because at some point the level of carryover, in a sense, is going to be very important. You need the study to be as effective and as precise as possible. But if you don't actually go out there and test the study on yourself, it's worthless. There was no point. Unless you were just using it to build your mind because you're curious, but that's not what YouTube Fitness does. YouTube Fitness takes studies and say, apply the study and you'll get gains. Okay, have you done it on yourself? Not just listening to the guy knowing he's right because he's your god on YouTube. Have you done it on yourself? If you haven't, you have no room to tell anyone to do it because you have no proof. That study is not conclusive evidence that this is going to work on you. And across the board, that is the worship of the one thing that in my experience deserves to be idolized, which is your own experience as a human. In what other aspects of life do you go through steps of understanding like you would do on YouTube Fitness? Almost never. And yet here we are with our physical development that in my opinion is as key as anything else in our lives, and we depend on a flawed process that is being sold and being pushed by charlatans. Across the board, it's flawed, it needs to be avoided. There was one thing that I wrote somewhere, and I think it's here. I wrote a higher knowledge, and that is important because I think it does underline greatly what I've been discussing from the start of the video. Science is being presented as that. It's a higher knowledge. And in reality, it could be defined as such because it's an amalgamation of the experiences of many that lead to a supra experience in a sense. And the supra experience has a good potential to shine and reflect positively on what you are going to experience. But the issue that you see arise is if the individuals that were grouped and used for the study were flawed or faulty in the first place, the reflection is going to be almost nullified, and the person who is going to actually make that group also have a strong ability to decide on what side they want that globe of information to shine. And all of that is to say that your opinion when you approach those studies is going to be just as important as the study itself. And if you eventually completely give up on your critical thinking and just rely on the opinion of others, then you're lost. And I say that why? I say that because, as I said, no one reads the studies. So what do they read? Nothing. So what do? They listen to the person who told them to read the study. And that is the perversity and the complete degradation of science that we see nowadays, where some guy who pretends to be a doctor has a study that he takes out of his pocket, shows the viewer and says, hey, look at that study, it proves that this is right and I made a program based on it. Want to buy it? And you look at the screen like this, and maybe you're drooling a little bit, and you're thinking, well, if he says it, it must be right. How many steps of comprehension have you just skipped completely? Because at the end of the day, that piece of paper that the guy showed you could just be a post-it with written on it, you're an idiot, buy my program, and you would have done it. That's not science. Science has completely deserted that environment. The YouTube Fitness that calls itself scientific is anything but. I don't want to ramble too much. Let's go to Scientism versus programming. This one's interesting. So as I said, I say Scientism because it sounds like a religion, which it has become, versus programming. Why do I end on that? I end on that because, in my opinion, if there is one type of science that is absolutely key for natural bodybuilding, it's programming. If you understand programming, you understand all the science you need. And there are on the side other aspects like the type of diet you're going to need, the type of movements that are going to agree with you, etc. All of these can also be attributed to a scientific approach that are going to go through a scientific process. But guess what? You don't need anyone for that process. The only thing you need is you. You might take pointers here and there, but at the end of the day, all of that is going to be run through you. You are the peers that are going to review the study because you are the guinea pig and you are the director of the study. You're the three at the same time. And if there is one aspect of it that is missing from what I just described, then science cannot be invoked. And to me, someone who is going to train for 10 years, who is going to do it their own way, who's going to take notes, learn how to program, come up with a good program, with a select amount of exercises, with a good diet that is going to make them live long, that person is 15 times more of a scientist than a lot of people on YouTube who are just really waving papers around saying, I'm right. And in my opinion, it's what we should strive to become. And to me, the paragon of that is programming, because the most important thing to get big is your training, and your training is programming. It's what's in your program. So that's what I promote. And I will happily and proudly call myself anti-science, because the science I am pro is the science of programming. And I just want to end with a little dig and a little introduction to the other videos of the trilogy, because keep in mind, this is video 1. After that, I'm going to make a second video that is going to take a different stance where I'm going to attack people that are anti-science. And I'm going to finish with what I want to say here, which is people who tend to rely on science tend to be small. And it's something I've noticed across the board. And the reason why is when you don't have the physicality and you don't have the balls to go after it and actually train, the last thing you have is science. Going on Google, reading papers, getting in arguments with people who are 60 pounds heavier than you that can curl you for reps, and thinking that you're somehow right because the paper says so. I'm going to tackle those individuals completely, because for the people who've been on the channel for a while, you understand that I detest them, but it's going to be for the next time. And the crux of the argument is going to also be focused around mental versus physical, which is a philosophical question that is interesting to detail. I also want to discuss the anti-science crew, as I said, and the distinction between empirical versus scientific evidence. And that is going to be for next time, because I do think that I did a pretty thorough job explaining my stance, because, of course, since I exist within the YouTube fitness community, it's not like I'm exempt of it, and therefore, I really want to make clear that I'm not going to play that game, I'm not going to show studies, I'm not going to provide clear evidence that I am right and I need to be worshipped as a god, because I truly don't care. I give advice, you want to follow the advice, you do it. I don't gain anything from this channel, I will never make a penny from this channel. I just want to help natural bodybuilders push their potential forever, and that's my one goal. Studies and stuff like this, I don't care about it. And for people who ask, everything I learned from YouTube Fitness, and the rest was me, my experience. I didn't read a single book on programming. I didn't read a single study on how to do curls. It was all action plus reflection. And I'm going to leave you on that. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.